Good morning, everyone. This is the Brattleboro Legislative Weekly Roundtable. I think we're on week 7, maybe, that we've been doing this together as a community. And been posting the Zoom link on Front Porch Forum and various places on Facebook for folks who want to join us. And if anyone doesn't have access to either of those, they are welcome to email any of your 3 state representatives from Brattleboro and we will send it to you. And so we've been doing this at 9 a.m. every Saturday as a way of welcoming the weekend and reviewing what's been going on in state government and what's been going on in our community each week, doing brief updates and then answering questions. I'm going to do a little technology tour, but I think everyone's done this before. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see your participant list. And when you pull that up, that gives you a chance to mute or raise your hand. Because there's enough of us that we all fit on the screen, are welcome to raise your hand. Kevin, I'm going to mute you because I'm getting some feedback from your, there we go. Okay. And so you're welcome to raise your physical hand if you want to say something or ask a question, or your electronic hand. It's totally up to you. And if your audio starts to get fuzzy when you're speaking, please feel free to turn off your video. It will make your audio better and then we'll be able to hear you. But appreciate people having their faces up in the meantime because it's nice to see everyone. That said, let's get ourselves started with updates from the week. Tristan, Mollie, do one of you want to start us off?
I'll start. Morning, everybody. Beautiful, beautiful day, finally. So the big topic that's been sort of prevalent in our world this week has been unemployment insurance and people's inability to get it, waiting, not hearing, getting strange messages, sorting out problems. We now have, was it just since the beginning of this week, I think, that we had the ability to collect people's information, like what they, just sort of pertinent information about phone numbers and emails and last 4 of your social security number and a description of the problem. And that information goes directly to the Department of Labor. That doesn't guarantee you're going to get a quick response, but it means that it's coming from a legislator. It's going to get some attention at some point. 26 of our colleagues have stepped up to volunteer to help the Labor Department, even though they've added tons and tons of workers and it hasn't really been enough, sort out a lot of the problems. And they're getting trained today and on Monday, I believe. So that is another development, another way of trying to solve the problem. And it was also legislative leadership that worked out the form, because people are just getting so frustrated at the end of their rope and running out of money. So I just want to let the public know that we are very concerned about this and keep trying to resolve the problem. But as our speaker said, we went from 2% unemployment to 20% unemployment. And they're just great numbers of people applying, and the system is not capable of addressing it in a timely way. So that's unemployment. I am expecting that Tristan and Emily might want to talk about some of the things we did in the legislature. I would like to talk about this bill that's going through, the things that they want to talk about what we did on the floor, what we actually voted on. I want to talk about a bill that's in the Corrections and Institutions Committee, and it's the Justice Reinvestment Bill. And it's a very, very exciting bill. And we had a presentation, Representative Sarah Coffey of Guilford, who's on that committee, gave a presentation to the Women's Caucus yesterday. And it's S338. And it's a very exciting bill. It addresses a lot of the issues that advocates, prison rights advocates have been talking about. And it's a very long bill. I haven't read it yet. It's about 42 pages long. But it basically is sort of addressing the issue of the, like 80% of the people who get sent back to prison, it's just technical violations of furlough or parole or And that's a big problem. And about 80% of the furloughs are just technical violations. So the bill is meant to improve public safety, reduce recidivism, reduce out-of-state beds, streamline furlough, improve data collection. And it's already, because of this crisis, has been noted that there's been a decrease, like forget how much percent decrease in the number of beds, like about like 100, sorry, I don't have that right now. But anyway, a number of decrease in the prison population. And we have this prisoners who are housed out of state because we don't have enough room. A lot of the money that's being spent is being spent on people who don't really need to be there, but they can't be released because of lack of housing. So the bill is meant to address a lot of these issues. And it's very exciting. It's most of the advocates, the ACLU, the Vermont Network for Sexual Violence, have been in the room. They're pretty happy with the bill, hoping that there'll be a section on compassionate release. But that is something that's non-COVID related. And the Representative Coffey has said that this is something that the speaker is allowing to go through the legislature this year. It's been sent through the Senate. It's in the House right now. So that'll be coming up at some point. And then transportation, we haven't been doing very much, but we will be this week looking at our transportation bill and looking at a very scaled down version of it proposed by the agency. And this is, again, going to be a little point of conflict about whether we will be just sort of doing not very much in terms of our climate initiatives, or if we can get some things in there. So we had some initiatives that were in the bill that actually passed our committee for electric vehicle incentives and public transit, money for public transit. And because of the situation with the $42 million hole in the transportation fund, things are getting very scaled back. However, there could be a stimulus bill coming in the future, maybe, out of the federal government. And just one more thing, I see Michael Bosworth is on, and the Council on State Government sends out a lot of information about energy. And just one thing, apparently the McKinsey consulting firm put out a report saying that every global sector must overhaul its emissions in order to meet the 1.5 Celsius goal of climate emissions, and proposing a radical overhaul. And this is McKinsey, the consulting firm, saying this. Emissions will drop by 8% this year, but there's certainly worry that once the economy starts up, they're going to just ramp right up again. So just a couple of little things to keep in mind. And I will end there.
Thank you, Molly. The Justice Reinvestment Act is, I think, a very good example of the kind of challenge that we have right now to be very COVID focused while we're learning to work remotely, but also not to abandon the kinds of opportunities that we have to do good policy work that makes Vermont better. And the Justice Reinvestment process to get to this point has been quite extensive and involved several different committees and joint House and Senate committees and lots of stakeholders. And it's emblematic of the kind of thing that we need to do to preserve our ability to function, even if it's just a little slower and a little bit less ambitiously than we might have if we're in person. Just to layer a little bit more on the Department of Labor situation, one of the things that I think we've seen over the last 6 weeks is, of course, the capacity challenge, but also then 2 weeks ago, the governor had 2.5 weeks ago, the governor had a press conference and said, this is on me. I was really focused on the health crisis and I sort of missed what was going on here, even though the legislature, through our leadership, the Senate Pro Tem Tim Ash and Speaker Mitzi Johnson, were in regular contact with the administration and said explicitly, this is a problem, it needs to get fixed. This isn't about money. We will work with you no matter what happens, to fund whatever expanded resources the department needs to solve this problem, and have been offering a variety of different creative solutions. 3 weeks ago, the speaker offered to recruit House members to field phone calls, and that was rejected, but now is actually moving forward. So as of yesterday afternoon, I think 26 House members have volunteered to be trained to act as humans who will actually answer phone calls, even though they're not the trained sort of case managers, but to help support bringing a more human face. Green Mountain Power has 30 staffers on it. There's a whole bunch of different public-private attempts to help resolve this. And I think where I'm getting to with in the sort of the second tier of frustration here is that the governor made a public apology, then said this will be resolved by the weekend, announced on the weekend that they had processed 34,000 cases in the backlog, and that there were only 8,000 that hadn't been resolved, and that those 8,000 would get checks. Made a big show of it, of taking the mail himself on Monday to be mailed. And quite frankly, the numbers were fictitious. Like, they didn't reflect reality in any way. There are many, many people who didn't get checks, who did not get their cases resolved. And so, and while they're continuing to work on it, on some levels, the sort of the accountability moment for the governor doesn't seem to have come back around to say, like, when you told us that this was done, what did that mean? And why did you take a photo, op of solving the problem at the final step, when in 4 days, House members and Senate members, using the tool that we created because we knew that there was an ongoing persistent problem a week after he said it was all fixed, that we've had over 1,500 people coming to us asking for help. There's just no way that they had an accurate read on the situation, and that so it's super frustrating. And at the same time, if we field too many calls because of the need that's there, then we're creating a new logjam in a different place, and the underlying problem isn't getting fixed. And so we certainly are trying everything that we have within our power as a legislature to hold the administration to their promises to fix this, and frankly, we need our constituents, the members of the Vermont public who are needing high quality service from their government right now, both to tell us how we can help, and if we can, and also to communicate to the governor and the administration that that it looks like his mail run to the post office 2 weeks ago was sort of like George Bush's famous mission accomplished fly-in to the aircraft carrier, and not an actual reflection of reality, and that's not acceptable. So with that, I'm sure there were other things that come up, and I'll turn it back to Emilie to see if she has anything she would like to add.
Thanks. I love that systems level summary of the debacle, and would like to add that in hopeful news, of the folks that I've been helping to sort of navigate their claims, I've seen a lot of people in the last few days who are self-employed receive benefits, never receive any notification or communication from the Department of Labor, but receive money in their bank accounts. And so hopeful that more resolutions will be coming soon through the efforts and the pressure of the legislature. And would like to say again, in the 80th place and the 80th time, that this is what happens when we chronically underfund a department and a program and a computer system for decades, and then try to depend on it when it needs us. So other things that have happened this.
Can I just interrupt you to say one thing about that?
Absolutely.
Because I think I'd like to make the meta point that you're making, but make it again.
Yeah,
So, which is not just that we've underinvested in this particular system, but fundamentally the notion that government isn't there to serve the people. That has had political traction in this country for a long, long time. And it shows up in Vermont in a less obvious way, but it shows up in incrementalism and in underfunding things that are basic resilient infrastructure that matter to real Vermonters in times of crisis or times of need. And so I just would like to say that I feel like the moment that we're in right now should be a repudiation of any sort of political narrative that says that that government is the problem, or some variation of that started with Reagan back in the 80s when he said, the worst thing in the world is to hear, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. That started this narrative in a deep way in our country that is completely false, and let this crisis show that is a false narrative. And then the real conversation is about how do we build a resilient system, and what does it look like, and how does it serve our needs, and not some Vermont incrementalist version of the I'm here from the government, and that's a problem. We know it's not the problem, and this should prove once and for all.
And what's exciting to me about this moment is that we are seeing so many more people are having experience with sort of government benefit systems, both on the legislative side and on the community side, so that more and more people are sort of aware of how incredibly important it is for those to be designed for the people who are actually interacting with them. And so that's really exciting for me too, because it feels like there's just so much more visibility on the value and the power of good government. Other things that happened this week that are also really exciting: the Senate passed hazard pay bill that provides additional pay, essentially in the form of a direct check to folks who are working in sort of essential worker frontline jobs, dealing with the public and making less than $25 an hour. And that bill is coming over to the House now. And then the House yesterday, because today's Saturday and yesterday was Friday, the House passed a stay on evictions and foreclosures for the life of the emergency order, and then for 30 days afterwards. And so that's a really wonderful next step in making sure that, in acknowledging that everyone needs a safe place to be. And realizing that that's really important for both public health and for people's personal health and well-being. And so the next step we really need to look at is what's going to happen after that, and how are we going to make sure that all the folks who are housed through this time can manage to stay housed afterwards, and how can we use the incredible funding that we're receiving from the federal government right now to really leverage into those kinds of lasting impacts rather than temporary impacts. I see Oscar has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had a bill number or a name or something for that last one.
There are 3s in it. Tristan,
Okay.
if you remember, I'm sorry.
It's S333, I think, isn't it?
S333.
There's 333, 334, and 338 that are in my mind, but I think it's 333.
Okay. I wasn't expecting anyone to have it memorized. Sorry.
The House calendar is really hard to navigate lately because there's so much old stuff from before we left that still sits there. And so that's what would be my easy reference usually. But it's on I posted about it yesterday. I think it's like the top post on my legislative Facebook page.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, sorry. And then other things that have happened that we passed, a bunch of sort of municipal level GovOps things that allow individual towns to change the way they penalize folks who don't pay taxes on time. And so that just gives more flexibility to towns to deal with economic stress. And then specific to Brattleboro, Brattleboro was not able to have a town meeting this year. And so the town does not have a budget. And so the town cannot create tax bills. And so we worked to get a specific bill in that drawn up to basically allow the select board to pass the warned budget temporarily so that they can continue to operate until we have town meeting. And so that passed out of the GovOps committee yesterday afternoon, and Peter was able to come testify for the committee, and then is going to be on the floor on Wednesday, which is the next time we go to the House floor. And I think should comfortably pass, and then we'll go back over to the Senate where Senator White is going to pick it up and move it out of her committee. And then there are a lot of concerns that have been circulating, and I think we've talked about a little bit before, about the Ed Fund and the deficits in the Ed Fund, or the shortages in the Ed Fund, or however we want to call it. And we're looking at a bunch of different policies. One is that Brattleboro School District does not have a school budget yet. And so we're looking at a similar proposal in House Ed that between House Ed and House Ways and Means that would essentially do the same thing that this town budget proposal does, which is allow school districts to pass warned budgets temporarily until the voters are allowed to vote. And that seemed like the best way to get as close to the desire and the voice of communities as we could, because it's sort of a smaller level of representation than the legislature trying to decide what was the appropriate budget for each community with limited information and limited time. And then sort of the next step is trying to figure out where the money for education is going to come from. What I will say is I'm hearing a lot of rumors and fears about the legislature mandating scarcity or austerity measures for schools. That's not going to happen this year. I can make no promises about what will happen, in 2022. But for the 2021 fiscal year, that's really going to be up to school districts to do that. And we're looking at various ways of finding funding for that. I cannot make any promises for what comes after that, because that will be up to towns to figure out their budgets. But we are not looking at any proposals that involve sweeping cuts of district level existing budgets at all. And so as districts that are making decisions around that are really doing that on their own. And it might be from a place of sort of trying to plan for future scarcity or what, but it's not on any advice from the legislature or even, I believe, the Agency of Education at this point. And so we're really looking at how we can fully fund the Ed Fund, which is sort of a complex mishmash of funding streams right now, with property taxes being one of them, acknowledging that probably most Vermonters can't pay any more in property taxes than they are in these difficult times. And that, I think, is the extent of my updates.
I have one more topic that that is sort of in the background right now, but I think we've talked about it before on our weekly conversations, which is what this crisis is exposing around equity of access to broadband and the impacts of that. And I'm going to just direct people to 4 documents that were submitted to the Senate Finance Committee on April 28th. Clay Purvis from the Public Service Department is the witness under which you will find this information. And they have an emergency broadband deployment plan, but some really great maps that show just where and how limited Vermont is. Even at the 25/3 standard, which 25 megs download, 3 upload, which is frankly deficient for instance, for
Yes.
very effective Zoom calls and other things. and actually, there's something striking, and I'm not sure that this is kind of going back to what I just said a few minutes ago about the choices about government. The funding needs that they estimate are between 85 and 293 million to ensure universal availability to the underserved areas on the current map. And I think it was just 2 years ago, maybe 3, but definitely within this governor's administration time period, that the legislature tried to come up with an additional funding stream on an annual basis to make some real progress here. And the governor said, Vermonters don't want us to spend money. We can't do that. We can't, I'm going to not sign any taxes or fees increases. And this is a fee, and I'm not going to let it happen. And so it didn't happen. And now that the emergency has revealed sort of the real structural inequities, now they're proposing $85 to $293 million in cost just to get the underserved areas up to speed. And I think he should be accountable for that. Like, he really misread the reality of the situation. The legislature has been trying to figure out a less incremental way forward. And even we deserve criticism for not having a transformative view of what is needed and what is possible, and to be content with incrementalism. But we at least tried. And the governor stood in the way. And now all of a sudden, now that he sees what actually is happening, he's suddenly not trying to stand in the way, but I'm afraid that they'll resort to more incrementalism. And so I just hope that as engaged citizens, and I know you all are, that you continue to support putting pressure on him to come up with a real structural solution that is not itself outdated in 2 or 3 years. We need fiber to the home universally, or something that is pretty darn close to that equivalent, in order to be sure that we future-proof ourselves. Oscar, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to, regarding broadband, just wondering if this perspective has been discussed. Obviously, I think all the goals are generally pretty great, but part of me is a little worried in a time where I feel like compact settlements and density are pretty close to address a lot of big concerns. I'm a little worried about the idea of running another utility. Like, I don't know how fully I believe this, but this is something I've been thinking about and I've heard about. But I do sort of like the idea that there is an attraction and a value to compact town centers, and that by running another expensive utility out to far-flung communities and outskirts, we are just weakening that again. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how to address that.
Can I take that one, Tristan?
Yeah, I think we may all want to take one, and we may all have slightly different views on it. Yeah. So let's, we'll definitely do Emily, then Molly, then me, and then we'll see.
I think that when we look at the impacts of Irene and what came after that, I think that's a really good model for me to be thinking about this, because in some utopian political vision, which I'm very capable of moving into easily, I see that, yes, ideally we have compact settlements, and that's best for the environment, and that's best for social engagement and community politics and all of those things, and resource management, and that, people, more far-flung regions are used for, particular kinds of agriculture or whatever. I can absolutely get there and see a politic that's designed around that. What that leaves out is that we have people living there. And when I think about the impacts of Irene, even in West Brattleboro, I think about folks who were living in floodplains and are still living in floodplains, and now can't get insurance on their homes. And as we sort of develop policies around ideals, whether that's environmental or social or whatever, if we're not able or willing to fully compensate for a really extended timeline of people and place and history of communities that might be in floodplains or really hard to wire for, you know, technology or whatever it is, then we're leaving people behind. And we can't do that because those people might not have the capacity, the social networks, the financial resources, or the desire to move. And we can't forcibly displace them, even if we even had the money to forcibly displace anyone, which we certainly don't. And so I think in terms of really super long-term planning, it might be best for communities and the environment to be more densely populated, but that's a really long arc. And so I think the more we really focus on both our village centers and our town centers as places of sort of resilient, robust economy and social contact, and know that people will be drawn to that and there's opportunities available for people there, we can incentivize that. But that doesn't mean that leaving people behind who are in our more far-flung areas is just or kind or appropriate.
Yeah, and I just want to say that like, all those reasons are the reason I'm raising this tentatively, but yes. Well, I'm interested to hear what everyone else has to say too, but I think everything you said is true.
Yeah, and this conversation certainly comes up a lot in the context of transportation, as we're trying to figure out how do we do rural public transit, et cetera. How do we help people who have to drive miles to work and they're driving in old cars, and it's there. You know, the chair of our committee has said, well, people just shouldn't live out there. And I'm like, well, they can't afford to move into Montpelier, you know. And so I think that, you know, certainly our villages have grown up around things, around water, around, you know, where there were mills and things like that. There are certain incentives in you know, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development for downtowns and for village centers. So, you know, that's one way of doing it, but it's a very complex problem. And I think that, you know, there are people who have farms. I mean, they live way out where there's enough land for them to farm, and we need our farms. So I totally agree with you. I think there are ways to incentivize people living in complex areas. There are ways to think about people who live out there thinking about carpooling and creating kind of their own little village center that can use fewer resources. Anyway, it's an interesting topic that you raise.
So I'm going to screen share in just a second, just to get a quick visual sense of this map. But I want to make one comment and then give a little context to the map for interpretive purposes. And I hear you, Oscar, that you weren't trying to like plant a hard flag around it and you were posing the question. So I don't want it to seem like we're beating up on you. I think the question is an interesting one about how do we nurture the village center development model, given where we are historically in the moment. Like, you know, we have already a fairly, you know, sort of, we have a certain amount of diffusion already out there. How do we use our land planning process to put even more muscle behind village center development? But one thing that, frankly, I think many Vermonters underestimate about the current situation of Vermont, and it's not, and you know, you live where you live, it's not your job to have a deep understanding of the dynamics of every other part of the state and every other community, is quite how rural a bunch of places are that people actually live and try to make a living in, and quite how serious the demographic problem is. And a substantial number of smaller Vermont communities, and frankly, even in Windham County, we are one of the older counties, but you know, and this is going to be a problem for us going forward too. They're literally dying. The economies are stagnant. The stores, the little village store that was the only thing that was in the village center, can't afford to stay in business. We have to figure out what the economic and cultural connection to the world is that will allow for these tiny rural communities to thrive. Or the village center concept can never get off the ground because there won't be one. There won't be people there to take advantage of it. It'll be, that, and this is a real fundamental challenge for this generation. And we have a certain number of people who are interested and attracted to the idea of stable population and 0% growth economy with a circular economy. And I'm, I've read a lot about that over the years, and I'm intrigued by those ideas as well. And there are some fundamental patterns to demographics that have to be accounted for. Like, that's an abstraction, but when you're in a real economy, and you're in a particular demographic flow, the consequence of no growth in population, for instance, for Vermont, is that we will wither and die. And we're actually been in that for the last decade. And we're not talking about that at a serious enough level. Let me show you this, share my screen real quick. The context that I wanted to offer here, and can you guys all see the top of this map? Is that on people's screens? Okay. The color coding doesn't matter. You can't give it a quick visual and say, oh, okay, red is the worst. It's actually the most expensive. So the sort of red, green, yellow is how much it would cost to bring people up to speed in that. But what I wanted you to see it for, and I'm going to zoom out just for a global view. Oops, that's a little too small. Is that there is a pretty good correlation between cost and things like density of the population and or places where it's already been built out because of commercial build outs from people, different commercial enterprises that have done it. And you'll see that even in our region, there's substantial differences. So Whitingham, 83% of Whitingham does not have 23/3 service right now. 81% of Marlborough doesn't. 98% of Halifax doesn't. And this area of the state has formed a community utility district to try to address this, because the private market isn't addressing it, and they're in the early stages of doing that. But I do think that when you see a map like this and you realize that the red is very expensive and likely very rural, and you look at the whole kingdom really, and a substantial part of sort of Addison and West Rutland counties, and a substantial part of Windham County, all really having pretty substantial build out costs because of how underserved those areas are. To me, that is a very quick visual way of understanding what has been the failure of the incrementalist approach, to say that we can just kind of muddle along here. Because in the modern global economy, the way I see it is that we want to live locally and compete globally. And we can't compete globally while living local lives if we are starved of access to the rest of the global economy, and particularly the information economy. Anyway, go ahead.
One, I just want to point out that on that map, even the edges of Brattleboro are in those red zones.
That's right, 3% of Brattleboro.
The bulk of West Brattleboro is in that red zone on the edge of sort of Guilford and Marlborough. And so it's here that it's also expensive and difficult, and there is not enough connection. And there are children in all of those areas who can't access school or do their homework in a pandemic environment and in a non-pandemic environment. It's just more striking in a pandemic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about farmers, you can't farm now without good internet. It's not just like people who, you know, I think we have an image of Vermont of the people who need connectivity are those folks who are moving up from New York to telecommute and, you know, bringing their money with them. And that's true, but it's also, you know, to get ag prices and to really market your products properly as a farmer, like that's needed there. And when we, you know, bring parts of rural Africa that have, you know, Kenya and Tanzania, those spots have gotten last mile connectivity because of farmers needing like gate pricing. It's not because of some sort of promise of a magical, you know, technological utopian future. It's really like, you know, a basic need for people to even enter the economy, not just compete. And so, yeah, everyone in the state really needs this. Allison.
Hi, taking myself off mute. What can we do? Do you think that it's effective, or do you think we should, people, citizens, like should write to advocate? Like, what should we be doing as people, and what tools are there to do that with? Like those maps, you said there's 4 maps, you know, that'd be useful. I can think of a way to use those maps personally. Yeah, what can we do?
So I think certainly writing letters, you know, or sort of letting political leadership know that this matters to you, and that it matters to you from a variety, you know, from an equity frame, or, you know, that the universal standard, and that you don't want us to try to default to the easy standard of we're not going to quite get there, and it's okay if in 5 years we're totally backwards. And you know, I know I named that on one of our previous calls together, that there was a period of time where we had top tier system in the numbers, and then when they redefined the numbers to reflect the modern updates in technology and expected bandwidth, we suddenly were one of the worst, and nothing had actually changed. The reality is that, you know, the standard that we steer to matters a lot. And if we set as a statewide goal the equivalent of fiber to the home as our universal standard, we will be much more future-proof and resilient and have true equity than if we say it's okay if we build out to rural areas with something that in 5 years is going to be completely deficient, and then we're going to we'll underfund, you know, that, so that we go in cycles where for 5 years the rural areas have something acceptable, and then for 15 they don't. Like, that's not a solution. And I think that political leadership at all levels needs to hear that.
Right. Thank you.
And I saw Michael had his hand up too.
I think Michael.
Yeah, this is actually a different subject. I think, well, it's all related, but the more sort of access to funding and resources we have, the more we can do. Right now, we're sort of scrambling for the resources. So how does this all relate to whether we get money, whether the state gets money from the federal government? You three must occasionally talk to our congressional delegation. Do they think that Senator McConnell's remark that let them just go bankrupt is serious or not politically feasible to, yeah. So are we thinking we'll get money from the federal government, or we don't know and we're planning around that? So.
I think there's a lot of unknowns, but I really trust our federal delegation to advocate for us in terms of the amount of money that we get. I think Vermont has benefited a lot from the small state minimum that we've gotten, and I think there are a lot of unknowns about what's happening with this next bill that's supposed to be including states. I don't know, Tristan or Emily, you might know more about that, what's actually expected. But what we've gotten so far has been fairly good, but I think there are problems with flexibility and how it can be spent.
Yeah, as Mollie said, we've already received an enormous amount of money, and we would in some ideal universe, like to use it for revenue shortfalls, of which are substantial, and we're not allowed to. And so that's a lot of where sort of our pushback with our congressional delegation is that we need money that's flexible enough to use for revenue shortfalls. However, it's a lot of money that, if it's not allowed to be used for revenue shortfalls, can be used for really exciting projects that we have been holding off on for a very long time and being failing in our incrementalism about, to use Tristan's language. And so as the money is sort of stands now, and the way our ability or inability to spend it is, we have money for this kind of project because we aren't allowed to use it for revenue shortfalls. And so that's sort of an interesting crossroads that we're sitting at. Tristan?
Yeah, on the BDCC business call this week, some of the congressional staffers are regular attendees, and they are talking about the next wave, and it looks like it's going to start in the House, and the House is going big. I think they're talking like $1.5–2 trillion, and that will also address support for states, and our Congressman Welch has definitely got the message around the advocacy around flexible spending to the extent possible. So that we'll see. I suspect. I mean, this is a really fascinating dynamic at the national level, right? That the scale of what is probably needed is such a, continue my theme, such a repudiation of the narrative of one party of the last 40 years, and you know that it's going to be hard for them politically to be ready and to warm to this idea of the scale of what is needed, but it's what's needed. And if they can make it flexible enough in this next wave that allows municipal authorities and state authorities to do more interesting things, it really could, with a state like Vermont where we're pretty creative, it could allow us to creatively redesign a whole bunch of systems that we've been wanting to do but don't have the resources to even touch, and to be able to bypass our own incrementalism.
That's just what happened when we had the stimulus bill in 2009, 2010, and followed by FEMA money from tropical Spain. It's a bill to really address a lot of issues with the transportation infrastructure.
We have just a couple more minutes. Is anything coming up for anyone? Yeah, Tony.
So sort of tangentially related to all of this, there's like Anna and Millicent and I don't know if anyone else is, are part of this BAMA, and there's like a large number of volunteers ready to do stuff. And I know Stephen, with a bunch of other organizations, is working on this gardening initiative. It just seems like there's a tremendous amount of available human resource to deal with a lot of issues. And it seems to me there's some difficulty in terms of organizing it and getting it figured out, which I think is probably happening. But you know what Tristan was saying about sort of the whole system being, you know, looking at it from a different way. It seems to me there is a possibility of leveraging this situation into the idea that there is a tremendous amount of human capital available to deal with difficult problems. I don't know how that would relate to broadband or, you know, other issues like that, but like Millicent has put together this IT team that's now starting to help local businesses deal with issues. So it seems to me that there's that, you know, if we can sort of coordinate the official stuff that you're doing along with these sort of, you know, pop-up volunteer results and volunteer capacity, you know, what can we do to utilize that? Because there's a lot there. I mean, I'm doing a bunch of different things and I'm pretty damn inefficient and I'm still getting things done. that, and I think there's a lot of people who don't know how they could plug in who could, and there are a lot of people who are plugged in and are starting to do a lot of stuff.
I'm really excited about, I think there's sort of waves of Vermont community history where new people sort of enter public space and enter community space and enter volunteering in a new way. And I'm so incredibly heartened by this big push of volunteerism right now, and want to make sure that we're integrating all the folks that are involved in Brattleboro Mutual Aid. And I think, you know, we're doing a pretty good job of that between how the Human Services Committee and how the Mutual Aid Group is really integrating, because we had this existing volunteer base in this community that sort of slowly started to age out. And it's important to keep on bringing new people in and new vision and new ideas and new ways of organizing. And so want to make sure that as this first flush sort of starts to move into sustaining mode, that we have the people and the resources on hand to really continue to do the organizing, because it's sort of that second stage where I think unless there's real resources for the organizing, people start to drift off, because it becomes, because then it's just regular life, you know? And so I think we're doing some really good work on that here. And I've seen, had a really good talk with our Agency of Human Services field director yesterday about how sort of existing infrastructure institutions can really integrate with stuff like Brattleboro Mutual Aid to make a big difference. And I think a lot of our political groups are thinking about that too. But organizing takes not just time, it takes money. And I want to make sure that as a state, and that we're like really communicating clearly with state government and with us as legislators about the need to fund collaboration and to fund collaboration in our communities, because it's not sustainable without that. Did that answer your question at all, or was I just like off on my own team there?
I actually did. I mean, I just, the main thing that you're saying is about, you know, I want to be able to take this capacity that is absolutely there and make sure that we can, you know, what can we do to maintain it and even grow it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really local. It's really happening. And I think, I don't know if you were asking like, how can we help the state? But you know, it would be great if we could get brigades of people to help with the unemployment issue, for example, but that's a really complex thing. But I think the more local groups and then reaching out to other groups is really a good starting point anyway.
It's 10 o'clock and I don't see any other questions. And so it seems like a good time for us to say thank you and farewell until next week.
Yeah, sorry we missed the first half of the meeting.
You know, we're all just living our lives here. No need to apologize. So on that, thank you and farewell. We'll see you next week. Tristan, you're muted, but I see your mouth moving.
Sorry.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone, and I'll send this on to BCTV. This time I won't wait a week.
Bye.
All doing the best we can. Bye.
Bye.